in the tobacco fields of Henrico County, Virginia, where the early morning mist still clung to the leaves, a discovery was made on September 14, 1811. A discovery so shocking that it changed how people understood human desperation. That morning, when the overseer arrived at the plantation house, he expected the usual routine: breakfast ready and laundry steaming in the yard. But instead, he came across something that would make even the toughest men break down in tears. Within a week, the case was so disturbing that 3 magistrates resigned from handling it. The body of Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, the respected wife of tobacco merchant Thomas Whitmore, was found inside the large iron washing pot behind the kitchen house. This was not an accident or some tragic mishap. The evidence showed a crime so deliberate and so carefully planned that investigators at first could not believe a human being could carry it out. What made the case even more horrifying was not just the cruelty of the act, but the realization that it had been executed with precise planning, almost with religious discipline, by someone who had spent years quietly resisting in ways that no one could see. Before we dive deeper into what happened on that Virginia plantation, I want to pause for a moment. This channel is not for everyone. It is only for those strong enough to face disturbing truths from America's past. If you are among the few who believe that even the darkest stories must never be erased, then make sure to subscribe now. Also, let me know in the comments what state you're listening from, because together we are about to uncover a story that many powerful people once tried to bury forever. The woman responsible for one of the most shocking murders in Virginia's antebellum history was known only as Patience. Born around 1785 on a rice plantation in South Carolina, she had been sold 3 times before her 20th birthday, each sale tearing her away from any sense of family or home. In 1807, when Thomas Whitmore purchased her for the large sum of $400, he thought he was gaining a skilled servant. She came with strong references, known for her ability to cook, clean, and handle laundry work. What Whitmore didn't realize was that he was bringing into his household a woman whose faith and strength had been forged through years of unimaginable suffering. At 16 years old, Patience had been baptized in the Kahi River by a traveling Baptist preacher who preached about a God who listens to the cries of the oppressed. She carried not only the Christian teachings of love, but also the fierce Old Testament belief in a God of justice, one who would not allow cruelty to go unpunished forever. The Whitmore plantation covered nearly 800 acres of prime tobacco land along the James River, about 15 miles southeast of Richmond. The main house, built in the Georgian style popular among Virginia's wealthy planters, stood as a grand symbol of wealth gained through slavery. Behind it were neatly arranged buildings: the kitchen house, smokehouse, spinning house, and finally, the slave quarters where nearly 40 enslaved people lived in conditions that ranged from harsh to unbearable. Thomas Whitmore liked to think of himself as a progressive plantation owner. He allowed his enslaved workers to attend church on Sundays, gave them basic medical care when sick, and even permitted them to grow small garden plots near their cabins. In Richmond society, he had a reputation as a fair, reasonable man who believed that well-treated property was more productive. But behind closed doors, Patience saw the truth. She witnessed the subtle cruelties, the humiliations, and the casual violence that revealed who he really was. Margaret Whitmore, however, was a very different person. She was the daughter of a Richmond tobacco merchant who had lost his fortune. She married Thomas not out of love, but for financial security, trading her fatting beauty for a comfortable life where servants met her every demand. At 32 years old, Margaret carried a cold kind of elegance, built on appearances but filled with private bitterness. She had no children, a fact she blamed alternately on God's judgment or her husband's failures. Where Thomas tried to appear as a benevolent master, Margaret openly enjoyed the absolute control she had over the household servants. She had created what she proudly called her system of proper discipline, which was really a method of psychological torture disguised as household management. She would assign impossible tasks, then punish the servants when they failed, cutting food rations, adding extra work, or humiliating them in front of others. From the very beginning, Margaret singled out Patience as her target. Maybe it was the quiet dignity Patience carried despite her bondage. Maybe it was the intelligence in her eyes that seemed to see through Margaret's pretenses. Or maybe Margaret simply knew that Patience's spirit posed a threat to her carefully controlled household. The abuse started subtly. Margaret inspected Patience's work with obsessive detail, criticizing perfectly clean rooms and meals prepared flawlessly. She constantly changed the rules for how tasks should be done, ensuring that Patience would always be found at fault. And when mistakes, or rather Margaret's invented mistakes, happened, the punishments were swift and brutal. In the winter of 1809, Margaret introduced what she called her correction system. Every morning at 4:00, Patience had to report to the main house for an inspection of her appearance and attitude. Any deficiency led to extra work that often kept her laboring until long after midnight. The sleep deprivation was intentional and cruel. It was Margaret's way of breaking Patience's spirit, forcing her into complete obedience. But Margaret had miscalculated. Instead of crushing Patience's spirit, the constant abuse only sharpened it, like sunlight concentrated through a magnifying glass. During the long nights when she worked alone in the kitchen house, Patience poured out her heart to God with an intensity that bordered on the mystical. She spoke of Job's suffering, of Moses leading his people out of bondage, and of David facing Goliath with nothing but faith and a smooth stone. The turning point came in the spring of 1810, during what plantation records coldly described as a disciplinary correction. Patience had been accused of stealing a silver spoon from the dining room, a charge she firmly denied. But Margaret insisted that Patience's denial itself was proof of guilt, claiming it showed the moral corruption that would inevitably lead her to theft. This time, the punishment was designed to be public and unforgettable. Patience was stripped to the waist and tied to the whipping post behind the kitchen house. The entire household staff was ordered to watch. With Thomas Whitmore away on business in Richmond, Margaret was free to unleash her cruelty without even the slight restraint his presence might have imposed. The overseer, Caleb Morrison, a man known for his brutality, administered 20 lashes while Margaret counted each one aloud. Her voice grew more excited with every strike as the leather tore into Patience's back. But what came after the whipping revealed Margaret's true nature. As Patience hung half-conscious, blood running down her back, Margaret walked over holding a cup of salt water. With false concern, she said, "This will prevent infection." Then, with deliberate cruelty, she poured the burning liquid over the open wounds. Patience screamed in agony while the other enslaved servants stood frozen, forbidden to help or even show compassion. That night, lying face down in her cabin, trying to tend to her wounds, Patience experienced what she would later describe as a divine revelation. In her pain and fever, she heard a voice as clear as thunder, words from the book of Exodus. "I have surely seen the oppression of my people, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows." In that moment, Patience believed she had been chosen as an instrument of God's justice, called to strike down the wicked and bring freedom to the oppressed. Ironically, the silver spoon that sparked this cruelty was discovered just 3 days later in Margaret's own jewelry box, where she had apparently placed it herself and forgotten. When confronted, Margaret showed no remorse. Instead, she claimed the punishment was still justified because, in her twisted reasoning, Patience had probably intended to steal something anyway. This absolute refusal to admit wrongdoing, even when faced with undeniable evidence, convinced Patience that Margaret was beyond redemption. From that moment on, Patience began to plan, and she planned with the same steady, methodical patience that had given her name. She understood one thing clearly: if she struck back, the act had to be perfect, complete, and final. There would be no second chances, no half measures. Her rebellion had to send a message so powerful that it could never be erased or ignored. Patience drew upon her intimate knowledge of the household, Margaret's habits, routines, and weaknesses. Most of all, she leaned on her absolute faith that God would guide her hand when the time for justice came. She began to see signs everywhere, little confirmations that the Lord was preparing the way. Margaret's routine was predictable. Every Tuesday morning, she personally inspected the laundry, examining every piece of clothing and linen for flaws that might justify punishment. The washing was done in a large iron pot behind the kitchen house, heated by a fire that had to be carefully controlled to avoid scorching the fine fabrics Margaret valued so highly. As autumn turned into winter in 1810, Patience began her quiet preparations. She studied everyone's movements, nodding when the yard would be empty and when Margaret was most vulnerable. She practiced moving silently through the house, memorizing which floorboards creaked and which doors squeaked. She slowly collected the materials she would need for what she had begun to think of as her sacred mission. There was a bitter irony in her plan. Margaret's obsession with cleanliness and order, the very tools she had used to torment others, would become the path to her own destruction. The woman who had used dirt and disorder as an excuse for cruelty would meet her end in the very pot where she demanded perfection. Through the freezing months of late 1810 and into the early spring of 1811, Patience refined her plan with the precision of a master craftsman. She learned to read the small signs that warned of Margaret's worst moods, the tightness around her eyes, or the honeyed sweetness in her voice that always came before a storm of punishment. Patience knew her moment was coming. What made Patience's preparation so powerful was her ability to see the patterns in Margaret's cruelty. To Margaret, her methods seemed like a carefully crafted system of control. But to Patience's sharp and disciplined mind, they were nothing more than petty manipulations from a woman whose power existed only because of slavery's structure. Recently, Margaret had introduced what she proudly called character-building exercises for the household staff. These sessions forced servants to confess to sins they had never committed, thank her for punishments they didn't deserve, and express gratitude for living conditions that were barely enough to keep them alive. Each Sunday evening, these exercises took place in the main parlor. Margaret sat in her favorite chair like a queen holding court over her subjects. In March of 1811, during one such session, Patience was made to kneel before her mistress and deliver a speech Margaret had prepared. In it, Patience was forced to say that slavery had saved her from the moral corruption she would have faced as a free woman. The words were poison to her soul, but she spoke them with flawless submission, eyes lowered, voice humble. Margaret never noticed the way Patience's fists clenched behind her back or the fire that burned beneath her eyelids. That night, back in her cabin, Patience opened her Bible to the Book of Judges and read the story of Jael, the woman who drove a tent peg through the head of Sisera, the enemy of God's people. Patience understood the message. God often chose the least likely people to deliver his justice. Just as Jael had been chosen, so too had she. The final piece of her plan fell into place when Patience uncovered one of Margaret's secrets. While cleaning the main house, Patience noticed that Margaret kept a locked wooden box in her bedroom wardrobe. The key was always on a chain around Margaret's neck, except during her weekly bath, which Patience was required to prepare and oversee. One evening in early April, while Margaret soaked in her copper tub, Patience carefully opened the box. Inside, she found evidence that confirmed everything she suspected about her mistress. The box held letters from Margaret's brother in Charleston, revealing just how desperate her financial situation had been before marrying Thomas. There were also records showing that Margaret had secretly been stealing small sums from the household accounts for years, stashing the money for her own use. But the most damning discovery was Margaret's personal journal. Page after page described, in disturbing detail, the punishments she had inflicted on her servants. The language showed not only her cruelty, but her pleasure in it. One entry, written just 2 weeks earlier, described the whipping Patience endured over the missing silver spoon. Margaret's words were breathless with excitement as she recalled the scene, focusing especially on the moment she poured salt water into Patience's wounds. "The girl's screams were music to my ears," Margaret wrote. At last, she understood her proper place in God's order. Reading these words, something shifted permanently inside Patience. The last traces of doubt about her plan vanished. She no longer saw Margaret as simply cruel or corrupted by power. Margaret was evil, a woman who took pleasure in suffering and convinced herself that her sadism was blessed by God. That night, Patience had what she would later describe to the magistrates as a direct message from the Almighty. In her dreams, she stood before a great throne, and a voice like rushing waters commanded her to be the instrument of divine judgment. She woke with absolute certainty. She now knew what she had to do and when. The opportunity arrived on Tuesday morning, September 10th, 1811. Thomas Whitmore had left the day before on a business trip to Norfolk, leaving Margaret in total control. Whenever Thomas was away, Margaret's cruelty seemed to intensify, as though the absence of even his mild restraint unleashed her worst impulses. That September was unusually hot. The laundry work was grueling. The massive iron pot kept at a rolling boil to clean the linens. Patience had been working since before dawn, her hands raw from lye soap, her back aching from hours of bending and stirring. Just after 9:00 a.m., Margaret appeared in the yard, dressed in her finest day gown and carrying her ivory-handled walking stick, not for support, but as a symbol of authority. She conducted laundry inspections like a military officer, examining each item with obsessive precision and always finding fault. Her voice came sweet and sharp. The tone that always signaled punishment was near. "Patience," Margaret called. "Bring me that pillowcase from the line." Patience obeyed quietly. She picked up the freshly washed linen and handed it over. Margaret raised it toward the morning light, tilting it from side to side as if she were searching for proof of failure. "There," Margaret said at last, pointing to a spot no one else could have seen. "Look at that stain. That faint dirt mark your laziness left behind. This is exactly the careless work I expect from you." The claim was a lie, and both of them knew it. The pillowcase was spotless, scrubbed and rinsed with the same care Patience always gave to her work. But Margaret had never been interested in truth. Her punishments were about one thing only: control, and the pleasure she took in causing suffering. "I'm sorry, Miss Margaret," Patience replied, keeping her voice calm though anger was burning inside her. "I'll wash it again." "Oh, you'll do more than that," Margaret said sharply, her eyes shining with excitement. "You'll wash every piece of linen in this house again. This time you'll do it properly, with the kind of detail expected in a Christian home." It was a punishment designed to break her. There were already dozens of items washed, dried, and hanging on the line, each one the result of hours of exhausting work. Now she was being ordered to redo them all under the hot sun, which meant she would be working until midnight. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing, pushing Patience to the point of collapse. But as Margaret laid out her impossible instructions, Patience felt something unexpected, an inner calm. This was the very moment she had been waiting for, the chance to act as God's instrument of justice. "Yes, Miss Margaret," Patience said softly. "I understand perfectly." Margaret heard only obedience, but the words carried a far deeper promise. Standing beside the boiling wash pot, with the Virginia sun climbing higher, Patience silently chose her path. From that moment forward, she would no longer be only a victim. She would become an avenger, an agent of divine retribution. The sunlight rose higher while Margaret inspected the wash, not realizing that each cruel word sealed her fate. Patience moved with steady, precise motions, following orders while her mind worked through distances, timing, and opportunity. The wash pot hissed and bubbled beside them, a heavy iron vessel long used for household chores, soon to serve a much darker purpose. "And another thing," Margaret added, striking the ground with her walking stick for emphasis. "This lazy work reflects poorly on me. When the ladies from Richmond come next week for my tea party, they will expect perfection in every detail. I cannot allow servants who don't uphold proper standards." That detail was important. Patience now knew Margaret had guests coming, which meant she would be harsher than usual as she prepared. Even better, it confirmed that Thomas would still be away on business. Margaret would be alone, surrounded only by the household staff. "I understand completely, Miss Margaret," Patience answered, lifting another piece of linen from the steaming pot with a long wooden paddle. Her movements were smooth, practiced from countless hours of labor. "I'll make sure everything is perfect for your guests." Margaret's lips curved into a smile. She mistook Patience's calmness for submission, never realizing that obedience could hide resistance. "That's better," Margaret said, stepping closer to inspect the wet fabric. "You see, Patience, when you put your mind to it, you're capable of acceptable work." "The real problem has always been your attitude," Margaret declared coldly. "You've never appreciated the Christian education this household has given you." The words cut, but Patience could not help nodding the bitter irony. Christian education. She had learned nothing of Christ's true teachings from her mistress. It was her fellow bondsmen who had shown her the faith of the oppressed, the faith of a God who heard the cries of his people, like he had in the days of Moses, when he sent plagues upon their tormentors. This was the God she served, not the false version who supposedly blessed slavery and cruelty. As Margaret went on with her inspection, Patience quietly began the first step of her plan. Each time she lifted a piece of laundry for Margaret to examine, she shifted her stance slightly, forcing her mistress to step closer and closer to the steaming washpot. Lost in her own show of authority, Margaret never noticed the careful maneuvering. "This sheet is still not acceptable," Margaret declared, holding up perfectly clean linen. "I can see water spots where you failed to rinse it properly." She narrowed her eyes. "Do you think I'm blind, Patience? Do you think I can't tell when you're trying to trick me with careless work?" "No, Miss Margaret," Patience replied smoothly, stirring the pot with her wooden paddle. Her tone was calm, respectful. "I would never deceive you. Perhaps if you could show me exactly where you see the problem." It was the sort of response Margaret adored, a chance to flaunt her supposed expertise. She leaned forward over the boiling water, pointing at the fabric with exaggerated precision. "There," she snapped, stretching her arm across the pot. "Right there, you see that spot, that discoloration from your sloppy washing." Patience leaned in as if studying it carefully, her face arranged in polite concern. "I'm afraid I don't see it, Miss Margaret. Could you point it out more clearly?" Margaret bent even lower, her face red from the rising steam and her own growing irritation. She was so focused on her display of superiority that she never realized the danger of her position. "Right there," Margaret jabbed her finger at the fabric. "How can you miss something so obvious?" The next moment came with the certainty of judgment. Patience moved swiftly, like someone carrying out an action she had rehearsed countless times in her mind. She seized Margaret's extended arm with both hands and yanked downward with all her strength. Margaret's scream tore through the air, only to be smothered as her head and shoulders plunged into the scalding water. The sound that followed was horrifying, part human cry, part bubbling roar from the pot itself, as though hell had opened at their feet. But Patience did not let go. With a strength she hadn't known she possessed, she held Margaret down, ignoring the violent thrashing of her victim. Margaret's legs kicked wildly, her feet scraping against the ground for support, but Patience's grip and position gave her every advantage. "The Lord is a God of justice," Patience whispered, steady and calm over the chaos. "He has seen the suffering of his people, and he has heard their cries." The struggling grew weaker, then faded. At last, Margaret's body went limp. Still, Patience kept her under for several more minutes, determined that no breath of life would return, no chance for this justice to be undone. Finally, she released her hold. Margaret's body floated face down in the washpot, her fine dress spreading out like dark petals on the water's surface. Patience stared at the sight, and for the first time in her life, she felt something powerful, a sense of completion, of justice fulfilled. Patience stood quietly beside the boiling pot, watching Margaret's body settle into stillness. Steam curled around her hands, but she felt no pain, no regret. What she felt instead was deep satisfaction. She had carried out the will of God with precision, and she knew it. She had been chosen as his instrument of justice, and she had fulfilled that purpose completely. Now came the part that required care. Patience's new discovery was certain, but she wanted the scene to speak for itself when others arrived. She arranged Margaret's body so the burns were immediately visible, clear evidence of the suffering that had finally been returned for years of cruelty. She placed the walking stick where it had fallen, its ivory handle cracked against the ground, a broken symbol of power shattered in an instant. On the clothesline nearby, the laundry Margaret had condemned still hung, each piece spotless. To anyone with eyes to see, it would prove the falsehood of Margaret's accusations and reveal the malice behind her punishment. Patience made no attempt to flee, nor to hide her role. She knew her act of divine justice would bring earthly consequences, but she was ready to face them. Calmly, she returned to the kitchen house and continued her duties, preparing the midday meal as though it were any ordinary day. When the others came for their work, they would find everything in perfect order, except for the terrible sight waiting at the wash yard. The discovery came just after noon. Caleb Morrison, the overseer who had carried out so many of Margaret's punishments, arrived to check on the laundry. His startled shout carried across the yard, bringing others running. Servants gathered, their eyes wide, but not with the kind of terror Morrison expected. Patience kept working steadily, chopping vegetables, her face serene. "What happened here?" Morrison demanded, staring at the body floating in the pot, his voice unsteady with shock. Patience lifted her eyes, her tone calm and certain. "The Lord has executed judgment," she said simply. "Miss Margaret has received the reward for her works." The unshaken certainty in her voice unsettled Morrison more than a scream would have. He had expected chaos, servants running in fear, the household thrown into confusion. Instead, there was an eerie sense of peace, as if something long awaited had finally come to pass. The gathered workers exchanged glances. Their faces showed surprise, yes, but also something else, relief, even satisfaction. For years they had lived under Margaret's cruelty, suffering through her punishments and sudden rages. Now the source of that fear was gone. "Someone must ride to Richmond at once," Morrison said shakily. "The magistrates must be told and a doctor called." Yet even as he spoke, he knew the order of plantation life had been shaken. The woman who had ruled through fear was dead, killed by one who neither denied the act nor feared its consequences. His own position, his authority, felt less certain in that moment. Through it all, Patience worked steadily at the kitchen table, cutting, stirring, preparing food with the same careful attention she gave every task. She had done what God required of her, and she was at peace. The earthly courts might condemn her, but she already knew the higher court of heaven had rendered its judgment. Word of the event spread quickly, first across Virginia, then far beyond. Travelers and newspapers carried the story, and it became more than a tale of a mistress, death. It was proof of slavery's cruelty, of the corruption that supported it, and of the faith and strength that helped the oppressed endure. For Patience, the moment she had prepared for had come. She had not only ended Margaret Whitmore's reign of cruelty, but had struck at the very system that tried to turn people into property and cloak abuse in the name of Christianity. Whatever awaited her now, she had ensured her act, and the truth it revealed would never be forgotten. The investigation that followed would peel back layers of corruption and complicity, reaching far beyond the Whitmore plantation. When the Richmond magistrates arrived that evening, they expected nothing more than a routine case of slave rebellion, one that could be settled swiftly with the harsh methods of frontier justice. Instead, they were confronted with evidence that shook the very foundations of the society they claimed to defend. Dr. Edmund Harwick, the county physician summoned to examine Margaret's body, made several chilling discoveries. The burns covering her head and torso were severe, but the pattern of injury revealed something darker. Margaret had not died quickly. She had been forced beneath the boiling surface and held there for several minutes after losing consciousness. This was no crime of sudden rage. It was a calculated execution, carried out with deliberate precision. More troubling still were the other signs Dr. Harwick uncovered. Margaret's arms bore old scars, the kind left by repeated defensive wounds. Her knuckles were battered, hardened from striking hard surfaces over many years. In his private notes, found decades later among his family's papers, Harwick confessed his growing suspicion. Margaret had long engaged in violent physical assaults against her servants. "The deceased shows evidence of habitual combat," he wrote in his confidential report. "The condition of her hands and arms suggests someone well accustomed to inflicting blows upon others. Whatever happened at the wash pot, it was not an isolated outburst. It was the culmination of years of cruelty." The magistrates now faced an unprecedented dilemma. Virginia law left no doubt about the punishment for slaves who killed their masters. But the evidence painted a far more complex picture, one that did not fit neatly into existing legal categories. Worse still, word of the incident was spreading quickly through the county. Public opinion was divided in a way that threatened the very stability of a society built on the unquestioned righteousness of slavery. Judge Cornelius Blackwood, the senior magistrate on the case, realized the stakes immediately. This was not merely a question of one slave woman killing her mistress. It was a direct challenge to the core beliefs that held Virginia society together. If the enslaved could claim divine authority in resisting their masters, then the entire institution was at risk. In a letter to Governor James Monroe, Judge Blackwood warned, "We are not merely judging the actions of one deranged woman. We are determining whether the institution of slavery itself can survive challenges from those who claim to act under divine sanction. The precedent we set here will echo across every plantation in the Commonwealth." The trial of Patience. Patience's trial began on October 15, 1811, in the Richmond courthouse, but it was unlike anything Virginia had ever seen. The defendant stood without remorse. She rejected her court-appointed lawyer, insisting that no earthly advocate could match the divine representation she already possessed. When asked to enter a plea, she delivered words that sent a shiver through the crowded courtroom. "I am guilty of executing the Lord's judgment upon a servant of Satan," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner. "I make no apology for being the instrument of divine justice. Whatever punishment you impose, I accept, for my true reward awaits in glory." The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samuel Morrison, had expected a simple conviction. Instead, they found themselves facing a woman whose absolute faith made her impossible to intimidate. Patience answered every question with scripture, turning cross-examinations into fiery debates about God's will. "The defendant claims divine authority for murder," Morrison thundered in his opening statement. "But the God of civilized Christians does not sanction rebellion against lawful authority. This woman has been poisoned by false teachings and dangerous ideas that threaten the very foundations of our society." Despite Patience's refusal to cooperate with her defense counsel, witnesses painted a devastating portrait of life under Margaret Whitmore's rule. Servants described years of arbitrary punishments and cruelty that had long poisoned the household. Sarah, a young house servant, recounted how Patience had once been brutally beaten for allegedly stealing a silver spoon. When the spoon was later found in Margaret's own jewelry box, the mistress had merely laughed. "She said it didn't matter," Sarah testified softly. "She told us Patience probably would have stolen something eventually. She said the punishment was for thoughts, not just actions." Then came old Moses, a man who had worked the estate for over 30 years. He testified that Margaret's cruelty had worsened with each passing year, especially after her unhappy marriage. Disappointment in her own life, he explained, was always balanced by greater suffering inflicted on those beneath her power. "Miss Margaret weren't always so mean," Moses testified, "but something inside her got twisted up. She started taking pleasure in hurting folks. She'd get this look in her eyes when she was planning a punishment, like she was thinking about something sweet." Dr. Harwick's testimony proved especially damaging to the prosecution's case. His medical examination had revealed clear signs of Margaret's long history of violence, and his professional opinion was stark. The defendant had acted out of desperation after enduring years of systematic abuse. "In my medical judgment," Harwick told the court, "the deceased engaged in patterns of behavior that constituted torture by any civilized standard. The defendant's actions, while legally inexcusable, were the predictable result of prolonged psychological and physical torment." Even more devastating was the testimony of Thomas Whitmore himself. Returning from Norfolk to find his world in ruins, he was compelled under oath to admit that he had long known of his wife's cruelty. "I knew Margaret could be harsh," he confessed reluctantly, "but I assumed she was maintaining proper discipline. I was often away on business and trusted her judgment in managing the household. Pressed further, Thomas revealed a troubling pattern of willful blindness. He admitted to seeing bruises, hearing screams, and noticing the fear in the servants' eyes, yet had convinced himself it was all a necessary part of running a plantation. His words laid bare the silent complicity that had enabled Margaret's reign of terror. Patience takes the stand. The trial, most dramatic moment came when Patience herself was called to testify. Rather than defending her actions, she turned the witness stand into a pulpit, delivering a fiery sermon on divine justice and the corruption of slavery. "You ask me to justify what I have done," she began, her voice rising with prophetic intensity. "But I ask you to justify what was done to me and my people for years uncounted. You speak of law and order, but what law protected me from Margaret Whitmore's cruelty? What order prevented her from torturing innocent people for her own amusement?" For over 2 hours, Patience spoke with unshakable conviction. She detailed not only her own suffering, but the countless abuses she had witnessed. Children beat unconscious for minor infractions. Pregnant women forced to labor until they miscarried. Elderly servants denied care and left to die in agony. "The Lord saw all these things," she declared, "and he chose me to be his instrument of justice. I did not act from anger or hatred, but from obedience to his command. If you condemn me for following God's will, then you condemn yourselves for serving Satan's work." The impact was electric. Many spectators wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, forced to confront truths they had long ignored. Even Judge Blackwood, known for his staunch defense of slavery, was visibly shaken by her eloquence. The verdict and execution. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one, yet satisfied few. Patience was sentenced to hang. Still, the trial had exposed truths that could no longer be neatly buried beneath the polite fictions of Virginia society. Her execution took place on November 30, 1811, before a crowd drawn from across the Commonwealth. Yet what the authorities intended as a warning became something far more dangerous, a moment of reckoning. Patience met death with the same unshakable faith that had sustained her through years of torment. Standing on the gallows, her last words rang out over the hushed crowd. "The Lord has used me according to his purpose. I go to my reward, knowing his justice cannot forever be denied." Aftermath. The wash pot in which Margaret Whitmore had met her end was immediately destroyed, melted down, and reforged into chains, as though the authorities believed they could contain the dangerous ideas it had come to symbolize. But the story itself could not be destroyed. It spread quietly through the slave quarters of Virginia, told in whispers around cookfires, repeated in secret gatherings. It became not a tale of murder, but of faith, the testimony of how one powerless woman had become, for a brief and terrible moment, an instrument of divine will.